episode of Rock Boys Football. Dill, Kalen DeBoer, Alabama. It just absolutely rolling on the recruiting trail. Four-star defensive lineman Nolan Wilson, Dill, one of the more coveted line of scrimmage players in the southeastern United States, committing to Alabama. Here's my big takeaway right off the bat. Look at this Alabama program on the recruiting trail. There were a lot of members of the national media. I'll put my hand up at times and say I had some concerns about what Kalen DeBoer could do recruiting his own backyard. You fast forward to 2026, there's a very clear pathway for Alabama to finish with the number one class in the country. But more importantly, I mean, just doing work in this region of the United States, which we knew was going to be crucial to Kalen DeBoer's success at Alabama. Look, I ain't breaking any news. Kalen DeBoer's a dang good head ball coach. And I know it looks a little bit different from Nick Saban. That don't mean he ain't a really, really good coach. You know, the biggest question we had was, hey, can he recruit at the level necessary to continue that Alabama standard of winning? We have gotten that question answered immensely over the last couple of months. Want to get into Nolan Wilson, but I also want to talk a little bit about where this Alabama program is going on the recruiting trail. Before we get into it, as always, the Alabama fans, appreciate you guys. It has been a busy last couple of days talking this program on the recruiting trail. Ton of support, especially from the new Alabama listeners. We appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, without further ado, look, you can talk Nolan Wilson. You can talk about Alabama on the recruiting trail. I'm going to give you the T-box here.
In the one thing I really like about how this 2026 cycle is kind of shaking out is you look at where these commits are coming from. I mean, they're coming from like kind of that deep South region that, again, you even go back to last cycle, like a lot of California, a lot of Texas. And Alabama should be able to recruit nationally. I'm not trying to make that point, but I look at the fact that, like, I think a lot of questions were asked about why the state wasn't being recruited quite as well. You look at this class, they are bringing in the top guys in the state right now. They're bringing in really good kids from Georgia. That, to me, I think is going to be an important part of the recipe for Kalen DeBoer is to be able to do a really good job in his backyard along with being able to go out to California.
And look, I think people made way too – and look, I'm saying people made a big deal of it. Like, I made a big deal of it. Like, I was wrong. I'm wearing egg on my face. You know, look, Kalen DeBoer has never really recruited this region. He comes over from Washington to Alabama, you know, kind of later on in the process, right? What did we expect? You know, he didn't have any relationships with these high school football coaches, didn't have many relationships, period, in this region of the United States. We had to give him 12 months to kind of dig his teeth into this region. Now that he has, like, it looks like, hey, Alabama's a powerhouse still recruiting this region. I want to get into Nolan Wilson real quick. And I think the biggest thing that I'll say, and it was really the biggest criticism we had of Alabama last year, is like, all right, what was the real thing that felt different from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer? It felt like they just didn't have the dudes on the defensive line. You know what I mean? Like, we're used to seeing Alabama win national championships, win SEC championships. And look, they had a lot of really good parts about their program, but one of the things that was constant and steady was that they dominated teams all along the lines of scrimmage, especially with that defensive line. You go back to 2024 and say, look, it wasn't bad. We ain't getting up here and saying it was bad, but it wasn't as dominant as we were used to.
Well, you didn't have the disruptors. You didn't have guys who are constantly in the backfield making plays, and that's why I look at what Nolan Wilson can be. Because, again, like, that's not like throwing shade at Tim Keenan and Tim Smith. Like, they do a good job at what they do. It was not easy to run the ball necessarily on Alabama into the teeth of that defense, but they didn't rush the passer particularly great. They weren't wildly disruptive. And I look at what Nolan Wilson and his skill set to be that big, that long, and move the way he does and get off the line of scrimmage the way he does, he feels like the type of guy that they probably need. And I mean, ultimately with Nolan Wilson, it's going to be about where they play him, because that's probably
where do you think he ends up playing?
I'm slotting him in the inside. And I look at where kind of Alabama's at with this class. Like, I just feel like they need bodies in the middle. That's probably the one concern, maybe, if you're going to have anything about this Bama team. And I look at Nolan Wilson. He's kind of lean right now in his high school days, but the frame could definitely get up to 300 pounds. If he can keep that kind of athleticism, I think he'd be a real problem.
I agree, too, because there's a lot of, you know, Nolan Wilson's what you call a tweener. You know, you're not sure, is he going to play edge? Is he going to be a three-tech? Well, what's he going to be? There are a lot of tweeners that you look at and say, don't see much more weight coming on. I know who I think what I say this for is Bryce Perry Wright. Like Bryce Perry Wright's a big, thick kid, but I don't know if he's getting much bigger. So I think he's more of a guy that probably understands the edge. You look at Nolan Wilson and say, that's a big, broad body with some real length. Like you put him in that Alabama weight room for about 6 months, and you could comfortably see him up around 280 pounds. And Dill, I don't think he needs to be 315 to be successful. He's going to win as a penetrator. He's not going to be this massive, imposing presence on the defensive line. He's going to use his athleticism. He's going to use his length. And Dill, I think he's going to be a problem for interior offensive linemen. They ain't going to be a lot of interior offensive linemen that can deal with that first step and with that length that Nolan Wilson brings. Here's the thing, though, regardless of where he plays, you feel like he's going to figure it out and he's going to be a little bit of a difference maker. And you pull up this class in 2026 and Dill, you're starting to feel better about the defensive line and what they bring in. And if you can go out and land Anthony Tank Jones, and it sounds like Alabama's probably the team to beat, you're suddenly looking at it and saying, hey, that's the class that we're used to seeing for Alabama as a defensive line class. And what I'll say is that, look, you can address a lot of other positions in the portal. It's really, you ain't going to find a Tank Jones or Nolan Wilson in the portal. You're not going to find those guys with that much upside on the defensive line in the portal. You want to go grab a difference maker, a wide receiver, you can. It ain't that hard in the portal. But finding guys that look like Nolan Wilson and Tank Jones, a lot more difficult. Getting these guys at the high school ranks for Alabama to kind of get back to that Alabama standard of dominance on the defensive line, it really big to close on Nolan Wilson, and now your eyes are set on a guy like Anthony Tank Jones.
Because again, you even look, that defensive line class was going to be an important one, coming probably off a last cycle where it wasn't necessarily a vintage Alabama defensive line class. Like Justin Hill, I think you're excited about what he can bring on the edge.
Yeah.
You look elsewhere, you didn't really necessarily have those difference makers. And again, I think the pipeline's pretty good. Like some of those true freshmen who played in the bowl game against Michigan, I was really, really impressed with. So I think you look, I think right now you feel pretty good about where they're at, but this was always going to be a huge cycle to bring in a couple of really, really good defensive linemen. And it looks like they're going to do it.
And I'll say this, Dill, I want as good of a defensive line as I can get in front of Xavier Griffin. Because if you want to maximize this kid, you want to be dominating the line of scrimmage. You want Xavier Griffin playing in space, and you want him playing clean. You really like where Alabama's going, and their average commit ranking is absolutely insane. Like, it might not be as big of a class as Georgia might bring in or as USC might bring in, but the quality of player that they're bringing in, it's impressive. We'll close it out there. To the Alabama fans, appreciate you guys. Again, a lot of new listeners, and we appreciate y'all rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.